Ladies, gentlemen, very welcome to FSR Talks. Today, distribution revolutions or not, we have to check. I'm very, very happy opening this talk. I've been seduced by the book written by Farhad Bilimoria, Christine Bornstedt, and a third author. It's a really well-mastered book, but of course, we have to discuss because a revolution is made of so many parts that thinking is always welcome. And to do this, we have asked an innovator in the area of distribution regulation, Tim Schittekate. Tim was at Florence School, but 2 years ago, he decided to go to MIT, which is a very good idea. And then he still knows what happens in Europe, but with a different view. That's the same for Farhad. Farhad also knows what is happening in Australia. And before that, he was in California, so he has different things in mind. Then, a short blah blah. Short blah blah is the following. About a decade ago, we have been said, wow, it is changing, smart this, smart that, smart grids, smart meters. But these smart things were roughly doing the same, but faster or cheaper. So it's a change, but it's not a revolution. A revolution is telecom becoming internet. This is a revolution. Do we have this type of revolution in energy? Oh, okay, we have digitalization. It permits a lot of things. We also have distributed energy resources. What was a joke 15, 20 years ago? Distributed energy resources was discussed in amphitheater in engineering school, but mainly to joke. Today is a reality. Even in Australia, 30% of consumers are also producers. And we are entering into electrification of all energy usages. Electric car, we all know that now. Electric heating and cooling, electrification of industry processes for jam manufacturing till steel, cement, or fertilizer manufacturing, an enormous change. But are these changes revolutions or only new things triggering a lot of chats, but not so many real changes? To get the answer, as you see, I'm not going to ask a chatbot GPT, I'm going to ask a real human, Christine and Farhad, because they are co-authors of the books. They will get 20 minutes to do this. Then Tim, because Tim has been a pioneer into showing that distribution is entering a novel age, 10 minutes, then 10 minutes with me, and 10 minutes with the general audience. We start. Christine and Farhad, you have the floor for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. It's a pleasure to be here. We've spent a lot of time looking at this topic because we think it's an important topic and really one of the keys to the energy transition. And so it's a great opportunity here to give my co-author Christine, as well as our co-author Ramat Udine, who is also part of this book, to kind of talk about our thoughts and ideas really with respect to the distributed network. Because I think this is one of the networks that has seen the most change and really the shifts in the way that we interact with the system. So I've got a few prepared slides that I wanted to talk through, and I'll just share the video here for a second. Hopefully it all works. All right. So this was the effort by the three of us. And what we really set out to do was to understand the transformation that is happening in the grid. Traditionally, we've been used to what we called a unilateral or a one-directional grid, where it was a centralized network of power plants over a high voltage transmission network into the medium and low voltage networks and onto consumers, which were relatively passive, both in terms of the way they used energy and also the way in which they interacted with the grid. Given the shifts in technology and the enablement of particularly rooftop solar, what we've seen is a transformation in the ways in which consumers interact with both the energy that they consume and also what they actually do in terms of providing energy back to the grid. So it's shifted away from this sort of one-dimensional, one-directional grid to this sort of bi-directional and in many cases multi-directional. And so now what we're seeing is, as we look forward to the next 10 to 20 years, we're also facing this new revolution on the distributed side with distributed storage, with electric vehicles, and really the electrification of many sectors and industry. And so the question we set out to ask is, how do we look at the way in which we regulate, run, and manage the distribution network, and how does it interact with the broader electricity network? Now, we tend to think of electricity and decentralization as being a relatively new phenomenon. And of course, in terms of the way technology is enabled and the shifts that it has, it is. But it actually is quite surprising when we look back to try and understand the history of electricity. The formation of the first electrical systems were actually developed with the idea of being distributed systems. They were small scale, they were actually located close to the users, and they were intended to serve a flexible array of usage. And I've got here on the left-hand side, what we found was the world's first prosumer of electricity. This was a gentleman by the name of Lord Armstrong. He was a very rich man, very well-established, had made his fortunes on a range of different businesses. And he had a big manor called Crackside, which is actually still existing here in Northumberland, in England. And he was put in the first hydroelectric station, which actually served to turn on his lights and keep his kitchen and his large dining rooms well lit. So this was kind of the history of what we found was the first prosumer. The other interesting thing when we look to the past is when we think of modern electricity market design, we tend to think of folks like Fred Schweppe, who really revolutionized this concept of spot markets for electricity. Prior to the seminal work in 1988 on spot markets, we actually look around 10 years back, and he had produced this work called Power Systems 2000, which was a starkly accurate and prescient view of the future electricity system, where he talked about a shift in the way of hierarchical control of the system, where consumers, where people at home will be able to buy and sell power at rates determined by supply and demand, an unbundling of ownership and operation, and really this sort of idea of a consumer starting to take ownership of that grid. Now, to realize this vision, there are still a number of challenges up in front of us. One relates to the issue of regulation and the unbundling of ownership of assets and the operation. We have significant issues relating to operational security and reliability. And then, of course, the more market-related issues of how do we determine access, and how do we coordinate between distributed systems and larger scale systems? And of course, ultimately, then how do we run the market? Are we going to have to run the market in the same way that we run wholesale markets, or is it going to have to be something different? And so when we talk about this idea of coordination and control, what we're really talking is pathways for DER, distributed resources, to interact with electricity supply. Now, there are a number of different ways to do this. We looked at it a number of different ways across the spectrum. But of course, from an operator's perspective, and having spent 6 years sitting at an operator, some of the key challenges related to DER related to their visibility and predictability and controllability in the system, all of which were actually not there for the most part. And so the challenge before us is to determine how we develop scheduling, how we co-optimize the infrastructure, how we coordinate markets for transmission and distribution resources, and of course, how we manage system and dynamic security. The other important thing that I'll talk about is the integration of decentralized resources in a broader market context. So, of course, decentralization is taking place in the context of wider energy system integration, but also the decarbonization of the entire economy. So we're not just talking about distributed resources, we're now electrifying much greater swathes of industry and the economy and interacting with other fuel sources and energy systems, including hydrogen, biomass, geothermal, etc. And so now you've got also this challenge of integrating across multiple layers, including temporal, spatial, network, fuel and service layers, managing time periods across annual variability, across interperiod 5 minutes to 5 minutes, and really integrating with this network infrastructure, which was not built for this two-way system. And so the risks and the opportunities here to society are huge. It is a critical linchpin for decarbonization and really changing the way in which we interact with the system. And so I'll now hand over to Christine, who's also going to talk more about some of these themes, particularly how we regulate and how markets might develop for the distribution.
Okay, thanks, Farad. We have now had a bit of an overview of all the changes in the system and the challenges that we have there. I will also share some slides to add a bit of a perspective on the strings that are being pulled to orchestrate this new situation. I can apparently. Oh. Can you, am I still online is the question? Can I get some feedback from someone? There was something on my screen about Zoom having quit, but I can, yeah, no, I'm still there.
Everything works, Christine.
Okay, sorry.
You may go in presentation mode as well. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, good. So yeah, I will add some perspective on the strings that we pull to orchestrate this new situation. And one of the options to get at this from a network operator perspective is, of course, the charges for access and utilization of the network, because that is an instant of interaction between the system and its users that's already in place. So obviously an intuitive response is to just change that slightly. And then again, with your question, Jean-Michel, is it a revolution or do we just do some small changes? This would probably rather buy into the first one, where we take this instrument that is now in place to finance the network infrastructure and strengthen maybe the second purpose of it, to coordinate network users with the grid. And already in charges that are in place today, we can perceive them as a bit of a toolbox of different types of network charges and sort of different combinations of them. I can only ever, because it's such a complex toolbox, put a couple of them on there. So here, you will recognize charges that are fixed and more of a flat amount to be paid monthly or yearly. You can have charges that are capacity based, and then capacity can mean the connected capacity as in the fuse. It can relate to the individual user peak load, or even what that would be coincident with the network peak load. So there's lots of different differentiations. And there's also a lot of charging schemes in place where we have charges per energy volume. And then again, you have the option of having this per withdrawal, per injection, or a net exchange with the grid. So we already have all these different charges in place right now, which could be the start
Christine, you are still on the opening slide. Your slide didn't move.
It did move for me.
No.
In that sense, I would just stop. No, thanks for notifying. So I would just stop sharing and maybe reshare again. And let's see if that does the trick. So sorry for the delay here. Share the screen. And then let me go into presentation. So is this now the propers? Like now, do you see the regulated charges?
Now it works.
In presentation mode as well.
It's not presentation mode, but it works. Yeah.
You were muted for a moment, Christine, and I guess it's due to your Zoom app, the issue.
Yeah, there's something weird
yes.
with my Zoom, but if you can now see the slides somehow, then I guess we should just continue.
Yeah, unfortunately we lost the slides, but you can also send me via email if you want, and I can display for you while you speak. And don't worry about the presentation mode. I mean, the slides were in a good size, so yes, you can stay here. We can see.
I think now they should be on, right? Just not in presentation mode. So
exactly, which is perfect.
Yeah, let's just stay
enough to read. Yes.
Okay, sorry about the complications.
No problem.
I don't always understand what's going on here. So where was I? We have these very differentiated options in the current tariffs already that potentially can help to coordinate this new system with the new users and new developments. However, these instruments, they're not only designed or not only meant and used to have an effect of efficient coordination, but they're also supposed to reflect some soft criteria, such as they should be simple, predictable, and accepted by users. And that doesn't always comply with this coordination challenge to the extent that we are presented with the challenge here. It also can be difficult to balance these different degrees of having time differentiated and locational differentiations. And also, depending on the setup, we can face some significant transaction costs, where having more intricate tariffs also means that they're more complex, and therefore they entail cost with the users as well as with the network operator who has to administer them. However, as Farad already mentioned, you have smart metering and also aggregators to help at least the user side deal with these transaction costs and maybe shield them from undue complexity. Imagine there was a Y in the end of that. In any case, from my or our perspective, we see a trend towards more differentiated tariffs currently. I mean, there's no trend without a counter trend, so you have some simplifications as well. But for example, if we look at the recent proposal on the market design in Europe, it clearly has this segment of a second tariff for a flexible user. This is energy tariffs at larger, but the grid tariffs should somehow match that. So even there we see that there is some room for complexity and for adding different dimensions in the tariff scheme. And then moving on from there, now also moving on in this slide set. It's a bit unfortunate, I have these two sets here now. Okay, so now you should be seeing the next slide. If you think this through and think it further, it will eventually lead of a new perception of what network access is in the first place, because you have the charges for it, but maybe also to just look at the whole access regime as something that is changing. And this can be changing not only to mitigate existing constraints, if we cannot give everybody access at all times and in all dimensions to the grid because it's not large enough, but also instead of developing the grid to be large enough for all kinds of access requests, in the future we could have a understanding of access where that's not necessary, not efficient anymore, and instead we manage capacity scarcity to the extent where that would be the most efficient solution. So the aim in the future could be to optimize network costs in line with the benefits that users derive from the network, and if they are not larger than what it costs to satisfy their requests, then it can be a viable concept to just not have access in some dimensions. And I've already mentioned some of the dimensions, such as time and also the direction of network access, injection versus withdrawal. With the charges, we already discussed how they could locationally differ. So in some parts of the grid, there could be more tight situations than in others. And then in this bubble graph that we have here, we also have additional dimensions of firmness, where network users could have access in such a way that they can be controllable. So they will, in some predefined limits, face to being cut off, whereas other users who will not accept this would have a firm connection, but only up until a certain capacity. Or it could even be from either the perspective of the operator or the user be random as to when the network access is not available. And then we also can imagine a differentiation of what I coin as the depth of access. So access at the local level versus access to the larger grid. In our case, moving beyond the distribution level then. However, this also, again, entails new challenges, such as how reliable is this for the users? Can they handle the complexity, and will they accept it? And maybe this will also entail some other issues of market power if it's predefined that some users, or, which could, for example, be generators, don't have access to the network in some dimensions and sometimes. And also, we look in the book at the option of assigning this access in an auction in a more market-based scheme rather than just rolling out a set of tariffs. And obviously there also you have lots of design issues, for example, with regards to market power and also the interaction with other market mechanisms that are in place. So while this is an interesting option, it's certainly not a very straightforward, very easy to implement option to develop the system in this direction. And then moving on again to also finish this up, having all these different innovative frameworks, if you will, also needs to at some point translate to the regulation of electricity networks, because a lot of this development centers around the network operator, and as there are still monopolies, it will continue to be regulated most likely. So whatever regulation is in place needs to give them the freedom, but also give them the incentives to sort of master and venture this transition. And it's particularly challenging to cover this transformation and also the innovation that it entails in what we historically had as regulation, where we focus a lot on networks being efficient and not extracting monopoly rents. But precisely this tightness might actually prevent them from being innovative and really thriving in this transition. So on one hand, we need mechanisms that cater for a certain level of uncertainty, which is linked to any kind of innovative operation. And there's a lot of innovation involved here. I already mentioned how we have this issue of incentives for efficiency may be colliding with innovative future things, but we also have an information asymmetry where the regulator doesn't really know what they want to induce as innovation. That's also the nature of innovation. And also it might take some time until we reap the benefits of that. And also we have this theme that the very purpose of the network evolves beyond just transporting energy to include other factors, such as a green transition, such as involvement of the users. And it's really not straightforward to incorporate that in the regulation. This is where we look at measuring more innovative outputs. And as much as it's nice to fluffily define them, it's very hard to tangibly deal with them in a regulatory framework. And with that, I'm coming to an end with my talk so that we still have some time for discussions and so on as well. By also integrating this perspective of local markets for decentralized flexibility, being sort of the maybe third, or well, no matter how you count now, another dimension of how to deal with this new complexity in the system and this new evolution. So there we can see how different concepts for local and decentralized markets are being discussed, are being developed. And you can maybe think of them in two dimensions, certainly more ways to think of them as well, where one would be mostly network operator centered, and a network operator would be the entity who sort of sets up a market platform to manage scarcity and develop capacity. But on the other hand, the same flexibility is also of interest to other participants, other actors in the system. For example, for a supplier or a trader to just balance the energy portfolios. And ideally, for an efficient coordination, they would interact in some kind of market. However, this market is signed up, you have to make some decisions, or some decisions will be made as to what products are being traded in those markets, what kind of pre-qualifications are required, and this will entail who can participate and who cannot participate in such markets. And you have to overcome a lot of challenges, for example, whether such market frameworks are vulnerable to some kind of strategy by the users that are trading on those markets, whether they include all kinds of flexibility resources that could potentially contribute to an innovative system, and also what kind of requirements to oversee these very markets that have been newly created. And then lastly, it's also a challenge to make sure that this sort of fits seamlessly in the overall structure of the sector. And arguably the energy sector is already becoming ever more complex. So adding a new element in there can be quite challenging. And with that, I want to thank you for bearing with me and also Farad for some primary inputs. I will stop sharing and look forward to some interesting additions and questions from our hosts and discussants.
So obvious that we have many changes. Some are little, others are extremely big or even radical, but up to Tim to discuss this and to ask questions and to do what you want, Tim.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Michel, for the freedom. Thank you, Farad and Christine, for the presentations. I made some last-minute slides, actually, because I think it's easier to discuss some of the concepts. And I have 4 different points. One is a bit the bigger picture, the organization of the power system in the future. Then the other one is unbundling, then rates, and then reliability. So maybe it's 4 is too much, but I'm just gonna go until Jean-Michel stops me. So here you can see one of the things that you're saying is that we really have to somehow coordinate between system operators, and we need to coordinate grid resources with the network. And this is a picture which kind of depicts how that coordination is done in real time in the EU today. And what you can see is that the green is good and the red is bad. So the green means that the TSOs, they kind of talk to each other, one TSO to another. There's this so-called implicit allocation of capacity, market coupling as we know it. But within the TSO area, the coordination between transmission grid connected resources and the transmission grid within the zone, that is not well done. But maybe that's the redispatch and the whole zonal nodal discussion, we all know about it. But maybe more worrying is that coordination between the DSO boundaries and the TSO boundaries, there is no sort of market-based allocation of that capacity whatsoever. And currently, kind of the coordination between the distribution grid and the resources within the distribution grid, which is the red boxes, there's also not really some sort of coordination going on there. That's where these local energy markets work in. And what we want is these boxes to become as green as possible. So I think that was also touched upon in your book, and Farhad mentioned Fred Schweppe, which is kind of related to that, is that currently we have this organization, and this is the European style, where there's the TSO who's in I'm looking at the status quo, who's in charge of quite some functions, balancing system-wide, transmission redispatch, some voltage control, and coordination with the energy markets. And then within there, there's the distribution, the DSO, who does distribution, locational, let's say, redispatch on voltage control, which are these local flexibility markets and local energy markets. But somehow what is for me a bit disturbing is that the balancing is done at system-wide level, while the redispatch is done at local level, even though redispatch actions can somehow impact balancing problems. So let's say thermal grid issues are are quite related to frequency issues, even though those tasks are somehow, let's say, in a not very well organized way allocated to the TSO and DSO. And I think what you also point in, like, where do we have to go to? Do we go to the super SO, one big system operator which does all these tasks, great coordination, but maybe computationally not that easy? Or do we go to the so-called local system operators where we really have, let's say, inclusive, exhaustive system operation at transmission level, and then very much exhaustive system operation at local level, and somehow via aggregation, these two talk to each other. So I wonder which side are you picking? Because I know that the status quo within the next, let's say, decade will become more and more problematic. Then the other question, unbundling. Everybody knows about it, few want to talk about it. Right now, we have this DSO, who's in charge of owner of the grid often, and does the, I call it, local system operation. And in EU law, and I forgot the real terms, but I think it's legally unbundling with generation and legally unbundling with retail. Now, for me, as you say, I mean, there's a lot of economies of scope between the distribution grid ownership and local system operation. To really split that up, that seems to be kind of a mess, at least today. But that issue with the legal unbundling with generation and retail, I think for me is more pushy. Because if you think about these local flexibility markets, right now, one company can organize it, is the buyer, and actually can also be selling the flexibility because they are legally unbundled with generation. I mean, everybody will say, oh no, that doesn't happen. They don't talk to each other or all that kind of stuff. But this is really problematic. And I think this will push to a stronger unbundling between DSOs, generation, and retail, which I think, like the Netherlands, is an example where this has already been done. The question on, do we really need to split up the DSO into a DO and an LSO, just like we did the TO and the ISO, as is in the US and in the UK? I think that's maybe something that will come if we move to the right in this figure. And one other thing, which is in Europe very well known, but kind of hard to discuss, is we have so many small DSOs. If we really want them to be the center of this decentralized revolution, they need to merge. I think in a country like Belgium, it's okay to have like 3 or 7 DSOs, but you cannot have 600 DSOs or 800, or I don't know how many there are in Germany. I mean, you need to somehow merge them, at least their system operation. You can keep the assets in different municipalities or whatever you want, but at least the system operation has to be merged into bigger blocks, because there's a lot of investment and a lot of capability that is needed to kind of fulfill those tasks in the future. And then maybe redesign. I don't have slides about that, but it's one of my favorite topics, so I can talk without them. Is there's kind of a disparity between the US and the EU when you talk about network tariffs. And I think the EU is far ahead, because when I try to talk about capacity-based tariffs or demand charges, as they call them in the US, nobody likes them, nobody wants them. But I don't see another way to do something in a world where suddenly EVs and heat pumps will come in, because if you only have energy and everybody comes home and they even have, let's say, real-time prices, or they have time of use prices, there's 10% of people with an EV and they're concentrated in a rich neighborhood. So in the rich neighborhood, you might have 40%. And they all start charging when the off-peak period starts at 9 p.m. or whatever. The local feeder just explodes, or you need to upgrade it. So you need something that says, yes, it's great to charge in the night, but also spread your consumption. Don't do it all in these first 2 hours. And if there's no coordination signal there, then this will happen. And those costs will be incurred by, or will be caused by, wealthier people, and they will be paid by everybody. And that will create some sort of other equity issue that we're not aware of it right now. And I think, and also in the US, what they talk about more is load control. And I think it's a big question. How much can you do with rates? Like just giving a rate and letting somebody program its charging to it? Or just say, okay, I hand the control of my charging over to some utility, you do with it what you want, and I can override it. I think in the end, there's a lot of business models in the middle of those two, but it's really a question, if we really want to do this temporary and spatially granular, you need load control. But how many people do want load control? That is a big empirical question. There's some trials in the US where they do opt-out load control, and it's very popular. But it's very popular for, let's say, 20 times per year. But do you really want this to happen every day? Are we going to some kind of where somebody suddenly puts on your Nest thermostat, heats up your house, and you never ask for it, and suddenly you feel warm or cold? But maybe that solves some local constraint. I don't know where the boundary lies in this load control, but it's very efficient. But yeah, what is efficiency there? And I think it's very important to really make the distinction. What can we do with rate design in the next 5-6 years? What can we do after 2030? Because I like these ideas of auctioning network capacity and so on. But in many countries, like in Germany, in the US, in Eastern Europe, they're still having volumetric rates for grids. Let them first transition to something which looks at least something like what they have in Spain, Italy, or France, to then makes the next step. And I think Norway is maybe the most advanced in the world on that right now today. But we have to move not too fast, or otherwise we just gonna be pushed back, I'm afraid, because that acceptability is really an issue, as you also mentioned. And maybe I have to stop here, and the reliability maybe can come up later. Otherwise, I talk too much.
No, it was extremely good, Tim. And then I'm taking from my part to give Christine and Farhad the opportunity to answer to your comments. Please, Christine and Farhad, take 5 minutes to comment or answer Tim.
Are you going to go first, Farhad?
Sure. So I think so. I wanted to address a couple of points that were raised by Tim, and I think of some really good points. Particularly, and you know, I'm going to harp on this, and you can probably tell from my experience as the operator, this is, you know, one of the biggest issues to security of the system, is the way in which these resources interact. So we mentioned local voltage, which Tim mentioned there. That's a critical issue that you're observing, because ultimately, when rooftop solar is generating in the middle of the day, you know, typically, or maybe less so now, but folks did not used to be at home. So it was basically all this stuff pushing over, you know, and driving generation, resulting in over voltages. And then in the evening, you get these under voltage situations. So you need both a market incentive, but you also need a control scheme to deal with that. The other point I'd make is around stability and control. So one of the issues that makes network reliability a challenge for the transmission grid, but more so in the distribution grid, because you can't assume away impedances, is the interaction between disturbances that happen around the region and the way that your resource interacts. So one of the recent, about a couple of years ago, AEMO did some studies where they looked at the impact of disturbances on distributed resources, and over 50% of DERs in response to a disturbance up to 30 or 40 kilometers away disconnected. So it just shows that the impact can be actually quite widespread. So from my perspective, the focus on operational security in terms of managing and making sure these systems have the right control to make sure that they're sort of, you know, not contributing in an adverse way to the system is actually pretty important.
Thank you, Farhad. Christine?
Yeah, thanks. So indeed, those were really good comments and also a nice compliment to what we have already put. I'm going to just pick on 3 aspects. I was trying to largely relate to your 3 or maybe 4 slides. So the first issue you raised is coordination between transmission and distribution. I mean, we sort of made it easy for ourselves by just looking at distribution, and then we don't we can largely exclude the topic, but it doesn't go away just because we don't look at it. So the way I tend to think of it is that the grids towards each other are in a way users of each other. So the distribution grid is just connected to the transmission grid and vice versa. And therefore, a lot of those mechanisms that we look at to coordinate generators and consumers with the grid as such also are in a way fit and are in a way already applied in order to coordinate between the 2 grid levels. So in many jurisdictions, lower grids sort of pay in a way or are assigned charges based on their interaction with the grid. So to an extent, those mechanisms that are being discussed to coordinate users can also, to an extent, and that needs to be stressed, coordinate between the grids. But then when it comes to things like system operation, there should only be one in charge, right? So that it's not a self-propelling or self-sufficient system. And I mean, there it's really just a question to assign. Should it be at the local level? Should it be at the overall level? Or if it is mixed, then again, we have to have some good mechanisms in place to make sure it doesn't interfere and they're well aligned. And then leading towards your last point about the large SOs versus several, I mean, not looking at the different levels, but at the geography, where you say we have in many jurisdictions, especially in Europe, these very scattered, very small DSOs. And if they are each a system operator of only their own area, you sort of add another layer of complexity because you have already this problem to coordinate with the higher grid levels. If you also have different systems in place for all of the different fractions of the lower level, it just becomes ever more complicated. However, your conclusion of they just have to merge in order to for this to work. I mean, as a researcher, I don't even pick sides so easily, but I just say that I just want to stress how there's some concerns with that as well, because especially for the very small ones, they would arguably be in a very good position to reap benefits with, say, other energy vectors and so on. So if you look at heat and so on, it would be those integrated smaller grid operators who then are integrated also with these vectors in the grid development and so on. And that in this system that we're looking at in this transition also has a value in itself. So by just saying they have to merge, maybe we're losing some synergies, some economies of scope with some other areas, because it's not going to be so easy to merge on that level. However, in this general economic theory, we can just extract the system, and that's also what you allude to on your slide as well. If you just extract the system operation and leave other things with the local level, then I would agree it's probably a good approach to, well, and then you don't have to merge the companies, you just have to merge the function or create a layer that sort of performs this jointly. So that I can see more than just merging the actual companies, which will have a lot of resistance anyways. And then lastly, you focus on tariffs, and that's also one of my, well, I don't want to say favorite topics, but it also comes very easily to me. And you raise this issue of load versus energy charges and control versus voluntary mechanisms. And to me, that is very much ingrained in this concept of grid access. So if you think of access as not universal, not a given thing, if you think of it as something that can be restricted, you automatically land with some kind of control, because if your access is not whatever you want it to be, whether somebody pulls the trigger or whether that's already part of your scheme that you cannot access beyond a certain threshold or something like that, that essentially means that you're being limited, either controlled by a predefined contract or by somebody in that very moment. So essentially that sort of gets to it. And then within this framework of your access not being universal anymore, both those approaches, focusing on a tariff, but also being remotely controlled by some kind of management are still possible. And I believe it's really up to, yeah, maybe cultural aspects as well, whether you prefer one or the other, because for some cultures, maybe Anglo-Saxon, those price-based schemes are very intuitive, whereas others also prefer to have their stable rate and sort of security into the future, and then they prefer to be controlled in that. From an economics perspective, it's very exchangeable, but what actually makes a difference is that your grid access is not whatever you want it to be, unless you're also willing to pay for that right from the start. So that would be my perspective on that, and I hope I didn't go over time.
Oh, you went over time, Christine, but it does not matter. You showed that we are in a totally new world. We are even wondering if prices will be powerful enough to put all of this in order, or if we need some control, a control-based system. Also, of course, with prices, but a control-based system. And as you said in the last minute, we are leaving universal access. We will have accesses, and as soon as we have accesses, we have some types of controls. But I don't want to elaborate more. I would like to remind the audience that you can ask questions in the Q&A box. For the moment, we have only one question. And I will simply ask Farhad and Christine. For you, Farhad, Christine, what are the main sources of changes? Are they tech? Which one? Usages? Which one? Business models? Which ones? Regulatory changes? Which ones? Please tell me.
I think it's a really good question. And I think one of the challenges that we are dealing with here, and indeed is in play for many infrastructure sectors, is that regulation tends to lag technology. So while we have the scope to do all these great things with advanced devices, and that technology is evolving every day, the ability of regulation to keep pace, not only from a sort of an economically efficient perspective, but from a social license and a social acceptability, I think is really important. And to me, the issue of business model is pretty critical, because it's the regulatory framework that determines what business models are allowable and not. And just to draw one example here, with respect to the discussion where we veered into rates and how rates can be effectively designed, there's a big dichotomy here between systems that have made retail supply competitive, in which case it's really open to the retailers under a competitive dynamic to kind of figure out what rate designs work, what don't, the extent of control, and the extent of participation in the markets. If we don't have that level of contestability on the retail side, then it becomes more of a regulated question. And so we've then got to determine, or regulators have to determine, what's the optimal outcome for everybody. And I think one of the challenges of being a regulator in that market, I think it's quite difficult to actually create the right type of cake that everyone likes. So it's to me, it's that idea of if you're going to go down that path of decentralization of the system, can you actually think about decentralization of that business model as well? And does that does that fit with what the future vision of that system should be?
Christine?
Yeah, I'm just going to largely agree with you. I mean, in this framework where we have all these innovative technologies, and I believe we also have a lot of actors who want to do innovative things with them. So that's not really what's constraining this. People and technological options are there. It's really the regulatory framework, and that would include the market design and all these other aspects, which in the worst case can be the straitjacket or the foundation of this evolution. So that has to be in place for all the other things to work and to work together. So I would very much agree that that is what we should be looking at, because the other things in this very neoliberal sense, the market will take care of them, but the regulation and the framework really has to be determined by us as society and as policymakers. And I like to think of it these days as there is this option of getting it right and getting it done. And it's not necessarily the same thing, and there's value in both of them. So balancing that a bit is certainly the challenge.
Stefan Littlechild, a good friend of mine, was telling that fully designing services and rates is prohibiting suppliers and users to innovate. And I think this question is becoming more and more palatable. Huh? But I won't push my ideas, because my ideas I know already, so I do not care much. I will go to the box. For the moment, I still have only one question. The question is from Federico De Santi. I think he is a PhD student in Belgium. I'm not sure, but given the name, maybe. And Federico is saying, "Dear Christine, in your opinion, by adopting flexible contracts, does an issue on fairness arise among new and old generators being already connected, for instance, concerning the curtailment priority? Thank you. Could you answer?" And Farhad also, you have the right to say what you think. And after that, we'll come back to Tim.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very relevant question, because all these things we discuss as changes for the future, we have to think of how to transition and how to incorporate with what's already there. And then if you have someone who has been connected to the grid before all these ideas came up, or before we became aware of them, obviously the question is what to do with them. If you sort of change the access regime of an already existing generator based on these challenges, this will, of course, or has the potential to affect their business model. So there's the perspective of what, from an economics perspective, you would want to do, just like being efficient in the short term. You would kind of want to have a system where whoever derives the highest utility from using the grid, maybe can sell their electricity at the highest value or so on, they should have access. But then if maybe you also want to have some regulatory certainty, you want to sort of preserve some investment cases, and that might be a perfectly valid reason to deviate from that and actually say that grandfathering whoever has had access should continue to have access. I think it's not a yes or no question. It depends a bit on your priorities and also on the specific case. And in fairness is always a very, well, not always, but it is in this case, I think, a very subjective measure. So it's really just what a society is willing to accept and to put up with.
I was in summer 2000, 23 years ago, in California during the crisis. And many generators were saying, it's totally unjust. They are changing the rules and the prices for electricity while we have already invested. So we are stuck. The plans we had to make money with our investments are broken. And they were saying, you cannot change the system for existing producers. And it's very funny for me to see it again popping in a different continent for a different reason. Farhad, how do you see this point?
I think it's a really important question, because you're dealing with, ultimately you're dealing with consumers who have different levels of sophistication and potentially interest in engaging with the electricity market. And so, while we may think, certain things are efficient, certain things are the best, the most efficient outcome, what you've got to contend with, and this is, I think, where that sort of political vision and political courage needs to also step in from a governance and regulatory perspective, in terms of what that right answer is, because ultimately we want to get to that efficient system. And in certain situations, I guess, where grandfathering is relevant, there might be some important elements to keep in place, but we are in a transition. Things are going to change. And so I think one of the things that is important is being able to communicate those changes and have actually a pathway. So when you communicate a design initiative and an imperative, people have visibility of what's going to happen. Now, they may be still unhappy and disappointed, but at least they know what's going to happen. And I think that's where the sort of vision and pathway and planning has to take place, and you're actually communicating all the time with your constituencies and your customers on an ongoing basis. I think that's sort of where it moves beyond pure economics and regulation to engagement and stakeholder engagement and the like, which we all kind of I know myself tends to put on one side, but it is actually really important if you want to be able to implement the right initiatives.
Thank you, Farhad. Tim, should we give veto rights to supply the existing generator or the old generator or the old technology to generate? Or should we give full new rights to new usages, new users, inventing a new system in which there are assets being distribution grids, but yes, there are assets, but they are not the key of the electricity system. How do you see it?
It's a very complicated question.
It is yours.
I mean, I assume that the moment you take away the, let's say, firm connection from the existing, because that's what I would understand if you start playing, if you take grid access not as a universal right anymore, and you take that right away from the existing, that you have an army of lawyers which will start knocking on the door, which will create a lot of problems. And I tend to agree that there's a constraint, I guess, that you have to deal with in building further, that those rights were given. So I'm not necessarily saying that you should take that away from these existing ones. I mean, we've seen a lot in the crisis, certain rights that have been taken away from certain investments in other kind of ways, and I don't necessarily agree with that. And it does impede new investment as well, because maybe tomorrow it's kind of semi-universal access and the day after it's something completely different again. So you need some sort of firm legal framework to go forward. And it's a constraint, I guess, you have to deal with, but that's my not that progressive opinion about it, let's say.
So I will be rather unable to give a conclusion to the authors. Read their book, because in my knowledge, it is the best book we have on distribution issues. However, keep in mind that we want the success of decarbonization. We want net zero. To get net zero, the key is not to green existing electricity supply. The key is to change existing energy consumption. We have to electrify the max we can, mobility, heating and cooling, and industry operation. And what we cannot electrify, we have to use clean molecules. So the bulk of the success is not within existing electricity supply. However, in 2050, very likely that I will be in heaven when I have already booked a place. So it is your problem, Christine and Tim and Fred. It's not mine. But I wish you good luck if you give veto rights to existing supply to reach your net zero in 2050 with acceptable cost, acceptable security of supply. And of course, we will check in 2050 if there is somebody still taking care of FSR talks. Good afternoon to every one of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.